In this lecture, you're going to learn about event binding. Basically, we use event binding to bind data from the view template to the component class. So in the last couple of lectures, we learned about string interpolation and property binding. And using string interpolation and property binding, we bind data from the component class to its view template. This is one-way data binding where the data will flow from component class to its view template. But we can also bind data from the view template to its component class. And this can be achieved using event binding. Here, the data will flow from view template to its component class. So in this lecture, we are going to learn how we can achieve one-way data binding where the data will flow from view template to component class using event binding. Basically, using event binding, we can inform component class if something has happened on the web page. For example, if this button is clicked, we can inform component class about this button click event. If the user types something inside this text box, in that case, an input event will happen. So we can inform the component class about that input event. For that, all we have to do is we have to bind that event to the component class property or method. For example, currently what is happening is if I reload the page, you will see that this text box is auto-populated with this value John Doe. Now for this text box, what we have done is we have binded this value property with this name property. So this value is the attribute of this input element. We are binding that attribute using property binding, and to that we are assigning this name property. We have defined this name property inside our product list component class. So here we have this name property. So since we have binded this property to the value property of this input element, whenever this input element will be rendered in the web page, there its value will be the value stored in this name property. So in this name property, we are storing John Doe, and that has been rendered inside that input element, inside that text box. If we go back and if we change its value to something maybe John Smith, in that case, this value will be rendered in the input element. As you can see, now John Smith is being rendered. So here the data is flowing from component class to view template, and that is happening using property binding. Let me go ahead and let me remove this property from here. Now what we want is whenever the user types something inside this input element, we want to assign that value to the name property. Currently that is not happening. So to prove that, let me go ahead and let me add a line break here. And after that, let's go ahead and let's add a paragraph. And in there, let's say name equals, and then here we want to render the value of name property. Okay, if I save the changes now, if I go to the web page, you will notice that the value of the name property has been rendered here. Right, but if I go ahead and if I change this text box value to maybe Mark, you see the value of name property is still John Smith. It has not changed. That's because currently the data is flowing from component class to view template. Okay, if we change something inside this input element, that value not get assigned back to this name property. But we can do that using event binding. So whenever we type something inside this text box, every time we enter a character, an input event will happen. So an input event will be raised. And we can handle that input event using event binding. And whenever that input event will happen, we can execute some logic. Let's see how we can do that. So let's go back to VS Code. And here we are doing property binding. Now let's go ahead and let's do event binding. So here we want to handle input event. Okay, and for the event binding, all we have to do is we have to wrap that event name within parentheses like this. So for the property binding, we wrap the HTML property within square brackets. And for the event binding, we wrap the event within parentheses like this. And now here inside these double quotes, we can write any TypeScript expression. Here I will simply say on name change. Okay, so here I'm assigning a method to this input event called on name change. And since we don't have this method inside our TypeScript class, we have this error. Let's go ahead and let's create this method inside our TypeScript class. Maybe here. Okay. So now what will happen is whenever this input event will happen on this input element, this method will be called. Now inside this method, we have not written any logic. So let's go ahead and let's write some logic here. Here, let's simply say this dot name. So this name is this name property equals maybe mark. Okay. So if I save the changes, now what will happen is whenever we type something inside this text box, an input event will happen. And when that input event will happen, since we have binded that input event to this method will be called. And when this method will be called, it will set this name property to mark. Currently it is John Smith, but now when the input event will happen, it will be set to mark. Let's see that. Let's go back to the web page. And if I go ahead and if I type any character inside this, an input event will occur. For example, if I enter A, you see an input event has occurred. And when that input event has occurred, I typed A here. But when I typed A, input event occurred, it changed the name property to mark, and that mark has been rendered here as well as here. If I go back and if I change it to Steve, and if we go back to the web page again, now if I type something inside this text box, maybe X, you see that event occurred and there the name property changed to Steve, and that Steve you can see here. Now let me go ahead and let me remove this property binding from here for now. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Okay, so since we have removed the property binding, now you see this input element is empty. Now here let me type X. So you see when I typed X here, an input event occurred, and when that input event occurred, this method will get called on name change, and inside that method we are simply setting the name property to Steve. So initially it was rendering John Smith, but as soon as the input event occurred, it changed it to Steve. Right. So here we are handling the input event on this input element. Whenever that input event will happen, we are executing some logic. Basically, we are executing this on name change method. And this is what event binding is. Now here, what we want is whatever we type inside this input element, inside this text box, that value we want to display here. Now, how can we achieve that? Keep in mind that whenever an event occurs, an event object gets generated. So for example, here, whenever we type something inside this text box, an input event will happen and it will emit an input event object. Okay, and we will have access to that object using $event variable. So here, when we are assigning this method to this input event, basically we are binding this method to this input event. So whenever this input event will happen, an event object will be generated. In this case, an input event object will be generated. And we will have access to that input event object using $event variable. So this $event variable, it will contain the event object that has happened on the target element. In this case, the target element is this input element. So whenever this input event will happen, this method will receive this event object. Now here we have this error because when we have defined this method, there we are not expecting any parameter. But here let's go ahead and let's define a parameter and let's simply call it event. And for now, let's specify its type as any. Okay, and here let's go ahead and let's try to log that event object. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Let me open developer console here. Let's go to console tab. Let's clear everything. So now you see what happens when I type something here. Let's say I type M. You see an event object has been logged here. Basically, when I typed M here, this input event occurred. And when this input event occurred, this method was called. And to that method, we are passing this $event variable. And this $event variable is basically storing this input event object. So that input event object that has been assigned to this event parameter, and we are logging that event parameter. So this event is storing this input event object. Now, if we expand this input event object, there we have a lot of properties. And the property which we are interested in is this target property. So this target property is nothing but the target element on which the event has occurred. In this case, the event has occurred on this input element, right? It has occurred on this input element. So that target object, it is storing that input element. And if we expand that target object, here also we will have a lot of properties. Now we are not interested in all these properties. What we are interested in is the value property of that input element, that input object. So here we have that value property, and here you see it is assigned with the value m, the same value which we have typed inside this input element, inside this text box. Okay, so using this value property, we can get the value which the user has entered inside this text box. So this value property is present inside the target property, and that target property is present inside this input event object. And we have this input event object present inside this event parameter. So here we can say event dot target object dot value, and it should give us the value which the user has typed inside the text box. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Let me clear the console here. And now whatever I will type here, that will be logged here. So let's say if I press M, you see that has been logged here. If I say A, then MA has been logged here. If I say N, MAN has been logged here. So in this way, every time I enter some character inside this text box, that input event is raised, and whatever value we have entered inside this text box, that is getting logged here. I hope it is clear. Now what we want is whatever value the user has typed here, we want to assign it to the name property, right? So here we can assign that value to the name property. So in order to access the name property, we need to use this keyword. We can say this dot name, and to that we can assign that value, the value which the user has entered inside the text box. So initially the value of the name property is John Smith. If you go back to the web page, that's what you will see rendered here. Now if I start typing here inside this text box, you see that value is being displayed here, that is rendered here. All right, so this is event binding in action. Basically, from the view, we are passing data to the component class. You see, from the view, we are getting the data and we are assigning it to the component class property. So here, the data is flowing from view template to component class. And this we can achieve using event binding. Basically, using event binding, we can bind any event to a TypeScript expression. Here, we are binding this input event to this method. All right, now let's take one practical example. But before that, let me go ahead and let me wrap everything inside a div. On this div, let me add a CSS class and I'll call it ecart product container. Let me copy this class and let's go ahead and let's add some CSS for this class. I'll simply add padding, top bottom 10 pixel, left right 30 pixel. All right, now it looks okay. What I'll also do is from this HTML, let me go ahead and let me comment this input element and this paragraph element. From the TS file, let's go ahead and let's comment this name property. And since we have commented this name property, let's also comment this line because now there is no name property inside this class. So it will give us error. All right, now here I will create a new property called add to cart. This is going to be of number type. And initially, let's assign it with the value 0. Now in the view template, let me go ahead and let me add two button elements. So this one, I will remove it from here. And here instead of buy now, I'll say minus. Then let's add one more button element. There, let's say plus. And in there, I'll add a span element. And inside this span element, I want to render the value of add to cart property. Okay. And let's also go ahead and let's add some CSS for this button element. inside this CSS file. So here I will simply say padding top bottom 5 pixel, left right 10 pixel, and margin top bottom 0 pixel, left right maybe 5 pixel. Okay, with this let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. All right, so here we have this minus and plus button, and in between we have the value of add to cart property. Now what I want is every time I click on this plus button, I want to increment the value of add to cart property. And every time we click on this minus button, we want to decrement the value of add to cart property by 1. And to achieve that, on each of these button elements, we need to bind click event. So let's go ahead and let's do that. Let me close this CSS file here. And on this button element, let's go ahead and let's bind click event. Okay. And here also, let's go ahead and let's bind click event. Now, when this minus button is clicked, we want to call a method. Let's call it decrement cart value. Okay. And when this button element is clicked, we want to call a method increment cart value. Now let's go ahead and let's create these two methods inside our TypeScript class. So here let's go ahead and let's create that method. And in the same way, let's also create increment cart value. So when this minus button is clicked, we want to decrement the value of this add to cart property. So let me copy this property name, and there let's simply say minus minus. And when this plus button is clicked, in that case, we want to increment the value of add to cart property. So inside this method, let's say plus plus. And in order to access this add to cart property, we need to use this keyword like this. And here I can see we have some error, and arithmetic operator must be of type any, number, or big int. So here, okay, this should be number in lowercase. Okay, now that error is gone. So now if we save the changes and if you go to the web page, if I click on this plus button, you see its value is incrementing. And if I click on this minus button, its value is decrementing. Okay. So here also we have binded the click event, and whenever that click event happens on any of these two buttons, we are executing some logic. Basically, when this button is clicked, we are calling this method, and when this plus button is clicked, we are calling this method. Now here, let's go ahead and let's improve this functionality. So basically what we want is, we want to decrement the cart value by 1 every time the minus button is clicked. But as soon as the cart value is 0, we should not be able to decrement it anymore, because products cannot be in negative, right? So for that, let's go ahead and let's write an if statement here, and let's put this code inside that if statement. And in there, let's say if this dot add to cart, if it is greater than or equal to 0, then only we should be able to decrement it. And actually it should be greater than 0. If it is 0, after that we should not be able to decrement it. So let's test this one. Let's go back to the web page. And here if I try to decrement it, it is not decrementing. But if I try to increment it, it will increment. And then if I try to decrement, it will decrement. But after 0, it will not decrement. Okay, in the same way, we should be only able to increment the number of products whatever we have in the stock. So for example, this product, there is only 10 stock. So here we should be able to increment it only till 10. After 10, we should not be able to increment it. So let's go ahead and let's implement that also. So here we want to increment this add to cart if this dot add to cart, if it is less than or equal to product dot in stock. And in order to access this product property, we need to access it on this variable. Okay, so if add to cart is less than or equal to in stock, then only we should be able to increment it. Actually, again, it should be less than in stock, because if it is equal to in stock, that means if this add to cart is 10 and in stock is also 10, then we should not be able to increment it. So that's why I have removed that equal to. Let's put it within curly braces. Let's go back to the web page. So now if I increment it till 10, after that, I should not be able to increment it. Now, We can also disable these buttons once the product count is equal to whatever value we have for in stock. And also we can disable this minus button if the add to cart is 0. So I hope with these two examples, now it is clear what is event binding and how event binding works, and in which scenarios we can use event binding. This is all from this lecture. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.